I glided into Westmore Technology's glittering Excellence Awards Gala in my emerald silk gown, the thumb drive tucked discreetly in my clutch holding Richard's ruin. My husband of 15 years froze mid-laugh when he spotted me across the ballroom, his arm dropping from around his executive assistant's waist. The security guard, surprised, "Mrs. Westfield, we weren't expecting you," still echoed in my ears as I checked my watch. In exactly 30 minutes, Richard would take the stage to accept his Executive of the Year award and deliver the keynote speech I'd replaced this morning with evidence of his 5-year affair and financial betrayal. As he rushed toward me, panic replacing his practiced charm, I smiled serenely. "Eleanor," he hissed, "what are you doing here?" I met his gaze steadily. "Supporting my husband on his big night. Isn't that what a devoted wife does? I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss." 8 weeks earlier, I had been a different woman entirely. As the wife of Richard Westfield for 15 years, I'd built my identity around supporting his meteoric rise at Westmore Technologies. I'd hosted the dinner parties, maintained our social connections, managed our beautiful home in Oakwood Heights, and put my own career as a digital forensics specialist on hold when his demanding schedule required more support at home. That rainy Tuesday in April began like any other. I was organizing Richard's home office, a task he'd always appreciated, when his personal laptop chimed with an incoming email. Normally, I would never have looked, but the preview caught my eye. Condo closing, urgent. We weren't buying a condo. With 15 years of trust behind me, I clicked on the email. What followed was a cascade of discoveries that dismantled my entire reality in less than an hour. The email was from a real estate agent confirming the closing details for a luxury condo in Riverside Towers, one of the most exclusive addresses in the city. The correspondence mentioned both buyers and congratulated them on their new home. Attached were financial documents showing a down payment of $180,000, money withdrawn from our joint investment account 3 months earlier, which Richard had explained as a temporary transfer for a company acquisition deal. My hands trembling, I began searching through his files. Each discovery was another blow. Photos of Richard and Vanessa dating back 5 years, weekend getaways disguised as business trips, a separate email account containing thousands of intimate messages, financial statements showing regular transfers to accounts I'd never seen before. The most damning discovery came in a folder labeled New Life Plans. It contained divorce papers, already prepared but not yet filed, giving him primary ownership of most of our assets. A strategy document outlined how to minimize what I would receive in the settlement. And most shocking of all, a detailed timeline showing he'd been planning to leave me for at least 2 years, calculating the optimal time to ensure his position at Westmore was secure before making the split. I was still sitting there, surrounded by printed evidence, when Richard came home early, something he rarely did. "Eleanor?" His voice echoed through our vaulted entryway. "My presentation files aren't syncing to the cloud. I need to grab my backup drive." He froze in the doorway of his office, taking in the scene. His wife, surrounded by evidence of his betrayal, her face tear-streaked but eerily calm. "You weren't supposed to see that," he said finally. "Clearly," I replied, my voice sounding strange even to my own ears. "Which part? The affair? The condo? Or the plan to leave me with almost nothing after 15 years of marriage?" Richard straightened, his Italian silk tie, a Christmas gift from me, and something cold settled over his features. The mask of the devoted husband slipped away, revealing someone I didn't recognize. "This could have been civilized," he said, his tone almost bored. "But since we're here now, yes. Vanessa and I have been together for 5 years. The marriage hasn't been working for a long time, Eleanor. You must have felt it too." "What I felt was betrayed," I said. "Not just by the affair, but by the financial deception." "The investment account, Richard?" Our retirement funds? He shrugged, reaching for the backup drive on his desk. You'll get your fair share, though fair is relative considering I'm the one who earned it. I put my career on hold for you, I said, standing now. I managed everything in our lives so you could focus on climbing the corporate ladder. And I appreciate that. It was a valuable contribution. He tucked the drive into his pocket, his tone patronizing. But let's be honest, Eleanor. You've been living in my shadow for years. You wouldn't even know how to function in the real world anymore. When was the last time you actually used your forensic skills? Technology has changed. You're obsolete professionally, just like you are in my personal life. The calculated cruelty of his words struck me like physical blows. This wasn't a heated argument in the midst of discovery. This was the unveiling of what he truly thought, had perhaps always thought. I'll have my attorney contact you, he continued, checking his watch. I'm already late for a meeting with the board. We're finalizing details for the Excellence Awards. Next month, I'm receiving Executive of the Year. He paused at the door. I'd appreciate it if you'd be out of the house by the weekend. Vanessa and I would like to start moving things before the condo closes. And with that, he was gone, leaving me standing in a life that no longer existed. That night, alone in our bedroom, I allowed myself exactly 3 hours of devastated crying. When the digital clock on our nightstand showed 2 a.m., I got up, washed my face, and made a decision. Richard was right about one thing. I had been living in his shadow. But he was catastrophically wrong about everything else. The next morning, I called Melissa Zhang, my former colleague from when I worked at CyberShield Forensics. Despite 5 years without professional contact, she answered on the second ring. Eleanor, this is unexpected. I need your advice, Mel, I said, and then I might need your help. 2 hours later, we sat in a quiet corner of Revive Cafe, far from Richard's usual haunts. I laid out everything, the affair, the financial deception, the planned divorce. Melissa listened without interruption, her expression growing increasingly concerned. When I finished, she leaned forward. First, I'm so sorry, Ellie. What he's doing is beyond cruel. She tapped her fingers against her coffee cup. But you should know, your skills aren't obsolete. The fundamentals of digital forensics haven't changed. The tools have evolved, but your analytical thinking, your methodical approach, those are still valuable. It's been years, Mel. Yes, and in those years, you've been managing complex social calendars, tracking financial details, coordinating events, and essentially running a small business called the Westfield household. Those are transferable skills. She paused. But more importantly, you know Richard's patterns. You know Westmore Technologies from the inside. That's valuable. Intelligence. I felt a flicker of something I hadn't experienced in hours. Hope. What would you do? I asked. Melissa's expression shifted from sympathetic to strategic. First, secure your own position. Copy everything, financial records, emails, photos, the planned divorce strategy. Store it in multiple secure locations. I nodded, already, making mental notes. Second, follow the money. $180,000 doesn't disappear without a trail. There might be other accounts, other assets. And third, a slow smile spread across Melissa's face. Third, we will update your skills. Rapidly. I'm heading a new cybersecurity division at Archer Solutions. We have state-of-the-art tools, and I happen to need someone with your attention to detail for a short-term project. It would be educational. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. For the first time since discovering Richard's betrayal, I felt something other than despair. It wasn't quite a plan yet, but it was the beginning of one. One more thing, Melissa added, her expression serious. Richard's timeline suggests he's waiting until after the Excellence Awards to file the divorce papers officially. That gives you about 7 weeks. Why wait? I asked. Corporate image, she replied immediately. The executive of the year shouldn't be in the middle of a messy divorce. It would tarnish the moment. He's protecting his professional reputation. I thought about the Richard I'd seen in his office. Cold, calculating, entirely focused on his own advancement. It made perfect sense. 7 weeks, I repeated, to rebuild my life from scratch. Melissa reached across the table and squeezed my hand. No. 7 weeks to make sure he regrets ever underestimating you. As I drove home, to the house that would soon no longer be mine, I felt something shifting inside me. The shock and grief were still there, but beneath them was something harder, more determined. Richard had spent 5 years crafting his escape, carefully constructing a trap designed to leave me with as little as possible. He thought I was obsolete, helpless, unable to function in the real world. It was time to show him just how wrong he was. My transformation began the morning after meeting with Melissa. I arrived at Archer Solutions at 7:30 a.m., an hour before my scheduled orientation. The receptionist hadn't even arrived yet, but Melissa was waiting in the lobby, 2 coffees in hand. Early bird, she noted with approval. That's a good start. The Archer offices occupied 3 floors of a sleek downtown building, a far cry from the cozy forensics lab where we'd worked together years ago. As Melissa swiped her access card and led me through security doors, I felt like an imposter. Everyone we passed looked younger, sharper, dressed in the unmistakable uniform of tech professionals who knew their worth. Stop comparing, Melissa said quietly, noticing my hesitation. Half these people learned their skills from YouTube tutorials. You have foundational knowledge they don't. She led me to a small office with a powerful-looking computer setup. This is your base for the next 7 weeks. Your official title is Consulting Analyst. The project is legitimate. We're conducting security audits for several financial institutions. I can't promise I'll be useful, I admitted. Melissa's expression hardened. Richard really did a number on you, didn't he? The Eleanor I knew would never doubt her abilities like this. Her words stung because they were true. Somewhere along the 15 years of marriage, I'd internalized Richard's subtle diminishment. Each time he dismissed my opinions or suggested my skills were outdated, I'd absorbed it without question. The first week is going to be brutal, Melissa continued. You'll be updating your technical knowledge during the day and doing project work at night. Think of it as digital forensics boot camp. She handed me a USB drive. This contains your learning curriculum and access credentials. Everything is legal, but the methods might be creative. That night, after 12 hours of intensive retraining, I returned to the house that would soon no longer be mine. Richard had called to inform me he'd be staying at a colleague's place for the week. We both knew which colleague. I booted up my new secure laptop and began the real work, tracing Richard's digital footprints. As a digital forensics specialist, I'd once specialized in recovering and analyzing electronic evidence. Those skills came back faster than I expected, muscle memory guiding my fingers through command sequences and data extraction protocols. First, I carefully cloned Richard's personal laptop during his absence. Years of marriage had given me access to most of his passwords, and his habit of using variations of his high school football jersey number made guessing the rest surprisingly easy. Methodically, I extracted every email, every document, every photograph, and every financial record. The evidence of the affair was extensive but ultimately irrelevant to my purpose. What mattered were the financial transactions. As I traced them backward and forward, a clear pattern emerged. Richard hadn't just withdrawn $180,000 for the condo. Over the past 5 years, he'd been systematically moving smaller amounts from our joint accounts into a complex network of personal investments, all carefully timed to avoid raising suspicion. By dawn, I had documented transfers totaling just over $450,000, nearly half of our marital assets. Money that, according to his divorce strategy document, he never intended for me to know about, let alone claim. I slept for 3 hours, then returned to Archer for my second day of training. By the end of the first week, several things had changed. I'd moved out of the house and into a modest but secure apartment paid for in cash through a temporary sublease. I'd quietly opened new bank accounts and credit cards in my name only. And I'd worked nearly 90 hours between Archer's legitimate security project and my personal investigation. The physical and mental exhaustion was overwhelming, but also cleansing. Each day stripped away another layer of the compliant, supportive wife I'd become, and revealed glimpses of the sharp-minded professional I'd once been. On Sunday evening, Melissa visited my new apartment, bringing takeout and a bottle of wine. Progress. Report, she demanded, settling onto my second-hand couch. I pulled up a secure folder on my laptop and showed her what I'd discovered. Jesus, Eleanor, she whispered as she scrolled through the financial documentation. This is textbook financial infidelity. He's been planning this exit for years. 5 years and 2 months, I confirmed. The first transfer coincides exactly with the week he hired Vanessa as his executive assistant. You have enough here for a divorce attorney to tear him apart, Melissa noted. That's not enough, I said quietly. A contentious divorce would drag on for months, possibly years. He'd still emerge with his reputation and career intact. His position at Westmore would shield him from real consequences. Melissa studied me over the rim of her wine glass. What exactly are you planning? Ellie? I hesitated, then showed her another folder, this one containing information I'd discovered about Westmore Technologies itself. Richard isn't the only one with secrets, I explained. While tracking his financial movements, I found something concerning. Several transactions connected to offshore accounts that don't align with any legitimate business operations. Melissa's expression grew serious. Be careful. Corporate financial irregularities are dangerous territory. I'm being careful, I assured her. But I need to understand what I'm seeing. These transactions are structured in a specific way that suggests they're hiding something. And you think Richard is involved? I don't know yet, but the timelines overlap with his rapid promotions. I closed the laptop. I need access to Westmore's internal systems to confirm my suspicions. That's not something I can help with, Melissa warned. Corporate espionage crosses ethical and legal lines I won't approach. I'm not asking you to, I replied. But I do need legitimate credentials that would give me access to their building. Understanding dawned in Melissa's eyes. You're planning to get hired at Westmore. Not hired, I corrected. Contracted. Archer does security audits for financial institutions. Westmore has a financial services division. Melissa was already shaking her head. The conflict of interest alone would be problematic if I disclosed my relationship to Richard, I finished. But legally, as of this week, I'm using my maiden name again, Eleanor Vance, and I'm not applying as myself. I'd be part of Archer's audit team. For a long moment, Melissa said nothing, weighing professional ethics against personal loyalty. Finally, she sighed. I'll need to run this by Marcus, my department head. But theoretically, if Westmore were to request a security audit from Archer, and if we were short-staffed enough to need a highly qualified consultant, she left the sentence unfinished. The third week brought a breakthrough. Archer Solutions received a request from Westmore Technologies to conduct a security assessment of their financial data systems, standard procedure before their annual compliance certification. Melissa, as department lead, selected her team carefully. I was listed as E. Vance, Forensic Analysis Specialist. My credentials would give me limited but legitimate access to Westmore's systems for exactly 16 business days. It would be enough. Richard and I communicated solely through terse text messages during this period. He believed I was staying with my sister in Philadelphia, licking my wounds and consulting divorce attorneys. In reality, I was working 18-hour days, dividing my time between Archer's legitimate security projects and my increasingly complex investigation. The pieces were falling into place, but I still needed one critical element: concrete proof that connected Richard directly to the financial irregularities I'd discovered. Without it, my revenge would be incomplete. He might lose some money in the divorce once his hidden assets were exposed, but his career and reputation would remain intact. On the night before my first day at Westmore, I sat in my sparse apartment, sifting through thousands of financial records. It was nearly 2 a.m. when I found it. The thread that, when pulled, would unravel everything. Richard's signature on authorization forms for transactions that shouldn't exist. His employee ID linked to system access logs during times specific transfers were executed. His encryption keys were used to secure communications about the questionable accounts. I leaned back in my chair, exhaustion momentarily forgotten. This wasn't just financial infidelity against a spouse. This was potentially corporate malfeasance that shareholders, the board, and possibly federal regulators would find deeply concerning. The question remained: how to use this information for maximum impact. A quiet report to Westmore's compliance department might trigger an internal investigation, but those were easily buried. An anonymous tip to regulators could take months to develop into action. No, this required something more immediate. Something public. Something that would strip away Richard's carefully constructed facade in front of the witnesses who mattered most to him. As dawn broke over the city, I formulated my plan. In 3 weeks, Westmore would hold its annual Excellence Awards, Gala, the company's most prestigious event, attended by everyone who was anyone in the corporate hierarchy. Richard would be receiving the Executive of the Year award, the culmination of his ambitious career climb. It would be the perfect stage for his downfall. All I needed now was irrefutable evidence and access to the right systems at precisely the right time. I had 16 days at Westmore to make it happen. My phone chimed with a text from Melissa. "Team meeting at 8, ready for your first day at Westmore?" I replied with a simple thumbs-up emoji. But inside, a calm certainty had replaced the hurt and confusion of recent weeks. Richard had spent 5 years planning to discard me. I would spend the next 16 days ensuring he regretted that decision for much longer. Walking into Westmore Technologies as E. Vance, security consultant from Archer Solutions, rather than Eleanor Westfield, wife of the chief marketing officer, was a surreal experience. The same glass and steel lobby I'd visited dozens of times for company functions now represented something entirely different: a battlefield. The security guard at reception barely glanced at my consultant badge, issuing me a temporary access card with the bored efficiency of someone who processed dozens of visitors daily. He didn't recognize me with my newly darkened hair, minimal makeup, and functional business attire, a stark contrast to the carefully styled corporate wife who occasionally dropped by to meet Richard for lunch. "Archer team is meeting in conference. Room D, 6th floor," he informed me, already looking past me to the next person in line. I felt a momentary pang at how easily my identity had been erased. For 15 years, this had been Richard's world, and I had been merely an accessory, visible only in relation to him, forgettable on my own. The elevator doors opened on the 6th floor, revealing a space I'd never accessed during my visits. The executive floors I was familiar with featured artwork, plush carpeting, and corner offices with sweeping views. This level housed rows of workstations, harried-looking analysts, and the background hum of a corporate machine at work. Melissa was already in conference room D with 2 other Archer colleagues: Damon, a network security specialist with a perpetual 5 o'clock shadow, and Lynn, a young woman whose expertise in financial systems analysis had earned her a reputation as a rising star. "Team, this is Eve Vance," Melissa introduced me with practiced formality. "She'll be handling the forensic analysis portion of our audit. Eleanor, these are the Westmore liaisons." I turned to find 3 Westmore employees watching me with the wary expression of people who viewed security audits as a necessary inconvenience. I didn't recognize any of them, which was fortunate. "James Ritter, Information Security," said a man with thinning hair and tired eyes. "Alicia Navarro, Compliance," offered a sharp-featured woman in her 40s. "Ben Winters, Financial Systems," completed a younger man with an anxious demeanor. We exchanged handshakes, and I carefully modulated my voice into a slightly lower register than I typically used in social settings. "Looking forward to working with you all." The meeting proceeded with a review of the audit scope, systems access requirements, and reporting protocols. I kept my contributions technical and concise, establishing myself as competent but unremarkable. "We'll need administrator credentials for the transaction logging systems," Melissa was saying, "particularly for international transfers and executive approvals." Ben Winters shifted uncomfortably. "That's restricted access. I'll need to get approval from upstairs." "It's within the scope document signed by your CFO," Melissa replied evenly. "Page 3, Section 2. As they negotiated access parameters, I studied the room carefully. Like most modern conference rooms, it featured multiple cameras for video conferencing. I noted their positions along with the badge readers, network ports, and other security features. Knowledge that would prove useful in the coming days. By mid-morning, we had established our temporary workstation in a small office near the Financial Systems Department. Damon immediately began mapping Westmore's network architecture, while Lynn set up connections to their financial databases. My assigned role was to analyze transaction logs for unauthorized access patterns, perfectly aligned with my actual goals. "Remember," Melissa murmured as we set up our equipment, "we're here to perform a legitimate security audit. Everything we document needs to stand up to scrutiny." I nodded, understanding her unspoken warning. My personal investigation had to remain separate from Archer's official work. Any evidence I gathered for my own purposes would need to come through meticulously documented, legally defensible methods. The first 3 days passed in a blur of technical work. I maintained my professional persona flawlessly, speaking only when necessary, and focusing intensely on my assigned tasks. The Westmore employees gradually relaxed around our team, viewing us as competent professionals rather than threatening outsiders. On the 4th day, fate handed me an unexpected opportunity. "The YI executive floor is requesting an audit of their secure document system," James Ritter announced during our morning check-in. "Apparently, some board materials were accessible to non-approved personnel last month. They wanted included in our security assessment." "That wasn't in the original scope," Melissa noted, glancing at me with concealed concern. "I can handle it," I volunteered, keeping my tone neutral. "Document security controls align with my portion of the analysis." James looked relieved. "Great. You'll need to coordinate with Vanessa Moore. She manages the executive documentation protocols." I maintained my professional expression while my heart rate accelerated. Vanessa, Richard's executive assistant and affair partner, would be my direct contact. The risk of recognition was significant, but so was the potential access to exactly the systems I needed. "Not a problem," I replied calmly. "When should I head up there?" "She's expecting someone at 11, James said. 10th floor, executive suite." As I gathered my equipment for the meeting, Melissa pulled me aside under the pretense of reviewing technical parameters. "This is dangerous territory," she whispered. "If she recognizes you—" "She won't," I interrupted with quiet confidence. "Vanessa has met me exactly 3 times at company functions, always with Richard introducing me as his wife. She spent those interactions avoiding eye contact and maintaining physical distance. More importantly, she's not looking for Eleanor. Westfield here. The possibility wouldn't even occur to her." Melissa didn't seem convinced. "And if you're wrong?" I met her eyes steadily. "Then my timeline accelerates. But I won't do anything to compromise Archer or your position." At precisely 11 o'clock, I stepped off the elevator onto the executive floor I knew so well. But now I walked with the purposeful stride of a security professional rather than the measured grace of an executive's wife. The executive reception area featured the familiar backdrop of Westmore's illuminated logo and the same elegant furniture I'd admired during previous visits. The receptionist, new since my last visit, smiled professionally. "I'm E. Vance from Archer Solutions," I stated, "here to see Vanessa Moore about the document security audit." "Of course, Ms. Moore is expecting you. I'll let her know you're here." 3 minutes later, she appeared, the woman who'd been sleeping with my husband for 5 years. Vanessa Moore looked exactly as she did in the photos I'd discovered. Striking, with sharp features and the confident posture of someone accustomed to navigating executive spaces. Her tailored dress and architectural jewelry projected an image of professional sophistication. Up close, I could see what had escaped me during our brief previous encounters, the calculating intelligence behind her practiced smile. This wasn't someone who had stumbled into an affair with her boss. This was a woman with deliberate intentions. "Ms. Vance?" She extended her hand. "Vanessa Moore, Executive Assistant to the CMO. Thank you for fitting us into your audit schedule." I shook her hand firmly, meeting her eyes with professional courtesy. "No problem. Document security is critical, especially at the executive level." Not a flicker of recognition crossed her face as she led me down the hallway toward the executive offices. I was no one to her, just another technical consultant passing through her domain. The irony was almost painful. "We had an incident last month where confidential board documents were briefly accessible to department heads before final approval," she explained as we walked. "Mr. Westfield is particularly concerned about system vulnerabilities ahead of the quarterly reports and the upcoming Excellence Awards." "Understandable," I replied, careful to maintain my slightly lowered voice and professional demeanor. "I'll need to see the document management system and access logs to identify the potential security gaps." She led me to a small conference room adjacent to the executive offices and logged into a workstation. "This has the same access permissions as the executive document management system. Will this work for your assessment?" "Perfect," I replied, setting up my equipment. "I'll need a few hours to run a complete analysis. Should I coordinate with you or someone else when I've completed this portion?" "You can report directly to me," she said, handing me her business card. "I manage all information flow to Mr. Westfield. Sure you do," I thought, but kept my expression professionally neutral. "Excellent. I'll try not to disrupt your operations more than necessary." As she turned to leave, she paused at the door. "Your team comes highly recommended. Mr. Westfield is particularly concerned about information security right now, with several sensitive projects in development." The mention of Richard in this context, from her lips, tested my composure. I forced myself to nod professionally. "Rest assured, discretion is our specialty at Archer." Once alone, I took a slow, steadying breath. Then I began working methodically, conducting the legitimate security assessment as assigned while carefully exploring the system for the information I needed. The executive document system was a treasure trove of information, including Richard's entire work history, performance, evaluations, and his communications regarding company strategies. More importantly, it contained the board presentation he was preparing for the Excellence Awards Gala, the very presentation I intended to modify. Working systematically, I documented the legitimate security vulnerabilities for Archer's audit, while simultaneously mapping the system for my personal mission. By late afternoon, I had everything I needed: access pathways, security protocols, and a deep understanding of how Richard stored and processed his most important documents. I was packing up my equipment when the door opened. I looked up, expecting Vanessa, and found myself face to face with Richard. My heart nearly stopped, but my expression remained impassive. He glanced at me with the dismissive look he reserved for support staff and technical personnel. "Are you about finished?" I need to use this room for a call. Just wrapping up, sir, I replied, deliberately avoiding eye contact while continuing to gather my equipment. The security assessment is complete. He barely looked at me, already pulling out his phone and reviewing messages. Make sure to lock the system when you leave. Of course, Mr. Westfield. I walked past him, holding my breath until I was in the hallway. He hadn't recognized me, hadn't truly seen me at all. The man who'd shared my bed for 15 years had looked right through me when I wasn't presented in the context he expected. It was perhaps the most telling moment of our entire relationship. As I rode the elevator back to the 6th floor, a calm certainty settled over me. The pieces of my plan were falling into place more perfectly than I could have imagined. Richard's blindness to anyone he deemed unimportant, including the woman he'd married, would be his downfall. That evening, I reported my findings to the Archer team, documenting the legitimate security vulnerabilities I'd discovered in the executive document system. Melissa gave me a questioning look when the others weren't watching, and I responded with a slight nod. Mission accomplished. Over the next 7 days, I methodically gathered and verified evidence while performing my assigned audit tasks with meticulous professionalism. Each night, I returned to my apartment and carefully assembled the pieces of Richard's undoing: documents, transaction records, access logs, and authorization codes that told a damning story when viewed together. The Excellence Awards Gala was now just 9 days away. Richard's carefully constructed world was about to collapse, and he didn't even know I was in the building. With just over a week until the Excellence Awards Gala, my work at Westmore intensified. The legitimate security audit was uncovering genuine vulnerabilities that required documentation and remediation recommendations. Meanwhile, my private investigation had reached a critical phase. Late one evening, when most of the staff had departed, I remained in our temporary office, ostensibly finalizing audit documentation. In reality, I was following a complex money trail that began with Richard's authorization codes and ended in a labyrinth of offshore transactions. Still here? Lynn asked, poking her head into the office. Damon and I are grabbing dinner if you want to join. Thanks, but I need to finish correlating these access logs, I replied, gesturing to my screens filled with data. The pattern recognition. Algorithms are finding some interesting anomalies. Lynn nodded sympathetically. Don't stay too late. Building security gets twitchy after 9. Once alone, I resumed my careful analysis. The transactions I'd identified shared several commonalities. They all occurred within 48 hours of major marketing campaign launches. They all involved international payment processors, and most importantly, they all carried Richard's digital signature in the approval chain. By midnight, I had traced over $3.2 million in questionable transactions spanning the past 4 years. The pattern suggested a sophisticated kickback scheme involving Westmore's marketing vendors. Richard would award contracts to specific companies at inflated rates, and portions of those inflated payments would be redirected through shell companies, before ending up in accounts connected to Richard's personal financial network. It was elegant in its complexity and devastating in its implications. If exposed, it would destroy not just Richard's career, but potentially lead to criminal charges. I carefully documented each transaction, each approval, each connection in the chain of evidence. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about exposing genuine corporate malfeasance that harmed Westmore's shareholders and clients. As I compiled the evidence, I considered my delivery method. Simply reporting it to Westmore's compliance department risked internal burial. Richard had allies throughout the organization who might help minimize the damage. Regulatory agencies would investigate too slowly for my purposes. No, this needed to be public, immediate, and inescapable. The Excellence Awards Gala would be attended by Westmore's entire executive team, board members, major clients, and industry press. Richard's keynote speech, stored on the company's presentation server and scheduled to display on massive screens throughout the ballroom, presented the perfect vehicle. The next morning, I shared my legitimate findings with the Archer team, carefully separating my official work from my private investigation. The executive document system has several concerning vulnerabilities, I explained during our team meeting, primarily in the presentation management subsystem that handles the material for company events. Melissa glanced at me sharply but maintained her professional demeanor. What specifically are you seeing? Authorization credentials aren't properly segregated from content management functions, I replied, entirely truthfully. Someone with access to the system could potentially modify presentation content without triggering security alerts. James. Ritter from Westmore's security team frowned. That's concerning, especially with the Excellence Awards next week. Should we lock down the system? I've prepared interim security recommendations, I said, distributing a document I'd prepared. These measures will secure the most critical vulnerabilities while allowing normal operations to continue. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was providing legitimate security patches that would protect Westmore's systems from exactly the type of intrusion I was planning. However, I had already identified my access path and would execute my plan before these recommendations were implemented. After the meeting, Melissa cornered me in the hallway. "What exactly are you planning?" she whispered. "Nothing that will compromise Archer," I assured her. "I'm conducting a legitimate audit and providing valid security recommendations." "You know that's not what I'm asking," she pressed. "Eleanor, if you're considering what I think you are, I'm considering exposing genuine financial malfeasance," I interrupted quietly. "Nothing manufactured, nothing fabricated, just bringing existing corporate wrongdoing to light." Melissa studied me for a long moment. "And the method of this exposure?" "It's best for you not to know," I replied firmly. "Trust me, Mel. I'm not destroying myself or others for revenge. I'm simply ensuring accountability happens publicly rather than being buried in confidential settlements." She didn't seem entirely convinced, but nodded reluctantly. "Be careful, and keep Archer out of it." "Absolutely," I promised. That afternoon, I received an unexpected opportunity when Ben Winters, the Nervous Financial Systems liaison, requested my assistance with a security protocol issue. "We're getting unusual error messages in the payment reconciliation system," he explained, leading me to his department. "Since you're already analyzing our security layers, I thought you might spot what we're missing." The payment reconciliation system was exactly where I needed deeper access to complete my evidence collection. I followed Ben to his department, maintaining my professional demeanor while internally celebrating this stroke of luck. For the next 3 hours, I worked alongside Ben, legitimately troubleshooting the security issues while discreetly gathering the final pieces of evidence I needed. By the end of the session, I had access logs showing exactly who had authorized the questionable transactions and when they had occurred. "I think we've isolated the problem," I told Ben, pointing to a genuine configuration issue in their security protocols. "This authentication conflict is causing the error messages. I'll include the fix in our recommendations." Ben's relief was palpable. "Thanks for the help. You really know your stuff." If only Richard shared that assessment, I thought, but simply nodded professionally. Just doing my job. That evening in my apartment, I compiled the complete evidence: package, transaction records, authorization logs, communication records, and the complex money trail that led from Westmore's marketing budget to Richard's hidden financial network. The documentation was meticulous, irrefutable, and devastating. Now I needed to create the presentation that would replace Richard's carefully crafted keynote. I worked through the night, designing a presentation that mirrored Westmore's corporate template but replaced Richard's self-congratulatory content with a detailed exposure of his financial schemes. Each slide was clear, factual, and supported by documented evidence. No emotional language, no accusations of personal betrayal, just the cold, hard facts of his corporate malfeasance. The final slide contained the information on his hidden marital assets and the planned divorce strategy, the personal betrayal that had started this journey, but would now merely serve as the closing note to a much larger exposition of Richard's character. By dawn, the presentation was complete, simple, professional, and utterly damning. I had 6 days remaining before the Excellence Awards Gala. 6 days to execute the final stage of my plan. The next morning, I arrived at Westmore to find the office buzzing with pre-gala energy. Employees whispered about seating arrangements and award recipients. Marketing staff rushed through the hallways with sample materials and event schedules. "Big week," Damon commented as our Archer team assembled for our daily meeting. "Everyone's distracted by the upcoming party, which actually works in our favor for the audit," Melissa noted. "Systems are often most vulnerable during times of organizational distraction." She wasn't wrong, though not in the way she intended. The pre-event chaos provided perfect cover for my activities, as attention was focused on preparations rather than security monitoring. That afternoon, I requested access to test the executive presentation system as part of our security assessment. James Ritter approved without hesitation, concerned about the vulnerabilities I'd identified earlier. "Better safe than sorry," he agreed. "The last thing we need is technical problems during the awards ceremony." I was escorted to the audiovisual control room where the presentation system was managed. The technician, eager to demonstrate their capabilities, showed me exactly how the system operated and the scheduled content for the gala. "Mr. Westfield's keynote is already loaded," the technician explained, bringing up Richard's presentation on the control screen. "We ran a technical check yesterday. 28 slides, embedded video in the middle, closing with the new marketing campaign reveal." "Very impressive," I murmured, studying the system interface while mentally mapping my access strategy. "And this system connects directly to the ballroom displays?" "Yep. 3 massive screens, plus the table monitors at each VIP seating area," he said proudly. "Everything runs through this central control server, with backup systems if anything goes wrong." I noted the backup protocols carefully. My plan would need to address those as well. "I'll need some time to run security diagnostics on the system," I explained. "Standard procedure for the audit." "No problem," the technician replied. "I've got a meeting anyway. The system's all yours for the next hour. Just lock up when you're done." Once alone, I worked quickly and methodically. First, I created a secure access pathway that would allow me remote connection to the presentation system. Then I established a triggered file replacement protocol that would activate precisely when Richard's keynote began. Finally, I implemented subtle modifications to the backup systems that would prevent easy override once my presentation began. All of this was done using my legitimate audit credentials, but in ways that wouldn't trigger security alerts. To any observer, I was simply conducting thorough system testing. Before leaving, I ran a genuine security scan and documented several actual vulnerabilities that had nothing to do with my modifications. These would be included in Archer's final report, maintaining the legitimacy of our audit work. As I concluded my work in the control room, I felt a strange sense of calm. The mechanisms were now in place. In 6 days, when Richard stepped onto the stage to accept his Executive of the Year award, he would instead face the public exposure of his carefully hidden corruption. That evening, as I was leaving Westmore, I encountered Vanessa in the lobby. She was engaged in what appeared to be an intense phone conversation, her expression unusually strained. "I understand the concerns," she was saying as I passed, "but Mr. Westfield is confident the contract terms are appropriate. The board has already approved the preliminary." She broke off as she noticed me, offering a distracted professional nod before turning away to continue her call more privately. I maintained my measured pace toward the exit, but internally, I was processing what I'd overheard. Richard was still actively pursuing his questionable contracting practices, even as my investigation was uncovering his previous activities. His confidence in his own immunity was absolute. Outside, in the cool evening air, I allowed myself a moment of reflection. The path from devastated wife to calculated whistleblower had been transformative. I was no longer driven by the pain of personal betrayal, but by a clarity of purpose that transcended emotional reaction. Richard had tried to discard me as irrelevant to his life and career. In 6 days, he would learn just how consequential I could be. The last days before the Excellence Awards Gala unfolded with meticulous precision. Archer's legitimate security audit was concluding, with our team finalizing recommendations and preparing our official report. My private mission was also reaching its culmination, with all technical elements in place for Richard's public exposure. 3 days before the gala, I received an unexpected message from Richard, the first direct communication we'd had in weeks. The text was characteristically dismissive. Eleanor, need you to sign time-sensitive paperwork. The courier will deliver to your sister's address tomorrow. Sign where indicated and return immediately. Property division must be finalized before the end of quarter for tax purposes. I stared at the message, noting how perfectly it encapsulated our relationship. No greeting, no acknowledgement of the emotional magnitude of dissolving a 15-year marriage. Just administrative instructions delivered with the expectation of immediate compliance. The reference to my sister's address confirmed that Richard had no idea of my actual whereabouts or activities. He still believed I was licking my wounds in Philadelphia, not methodically dismantling his career from within his own company. I replied with deliberate vagueness, "We'll review when it arrives." His response came instantly. "Don't review, just sign. Everything is standard." Standard for whom? I wondered. For the husband who had hidden assets and planned his exit for years? Or for the wife who was supposed to accept whatever scraps were offered? I didn't respond, which prompted another text an hour later. "This needs to be wrapped up before the Excellence Awards. Time sensitive." Of course it was. Richard wouldn't want the messy business of divorce hanging over his moment of professional triumph. He needed everything neat and settled before he accepted his award, with Vanessa proudly watching from the audience. The courier arrived at my sister's house the following morning. Kate, who had been my steadfast ally throughout this ordeal, called me immediately. "There's a package here from Richard's lawyer," she said. "Do you want me to open it?" "Please," I replied, putting her on speaker as I continued working on final audit documentation at Westmore. I heard the sound of an envelope being torn open, followed by Kate's low whistle. "This is comprehensive," she said carefully. And by comprehensive, I mean completely one-sided. Property settlement, financial division, even a confidentiality clause preventing you from discussing the circumstances of the marriage dissolution with anyone. "What's the split?" I asked, already knowing the answer. "He keeps the house, his retirement accounts, his stock options, and apparently something called individually managed investment vehicles. You get your personal belongings, your car, and a cash settlement of $120,000. I almost laughed at the audacity. That cash settlement represents less than 10% of our marital assets, even excluding the hidden accounts I've uncovered. There's a cover letter saying this is generous given the circumstances and urging prompt signature to facilitate an amicable resolution," Kate continued, her voice tight with controlled anger. "What do you want me to do with this?" "Take pictures of every page and send them to me," I instructed. "Then put everything back in the envelope. I'll handle it." The document was exactly what I'd expected, a continuation of Richard's systematic financial manipulation, now formalized into legal paperwork. It would serve as the perfect closing evidence in my presentation. 2 days before the gala, Archer's audit team held our final meeting with Westmore's security department. We presented our findings, including the vulnerabilities I'd legitimately discovered in their systems. "We've identified several areas requiring immediate attention," Melissa explained, leading the briefing. Vance will detail the executive presentation system vulnerabilities, which are particularly time-sensitive given your upcoming event. I outlined the genuine security issues, recommending specific measures to address them. Measures that would take effect after the gala, conveniently. James Ritter took detailed notes, nodding seriously. We'll implement these recommendations immediately following the Excellence Awards, he promised. The system is locked now in preparation for the event, but we'll address these vulnerabilities in the next update cycle. Exactly as I had anticipated, the presentation system was now frozen for the event, with no further security modifications permitted until after the gala. My alterations were safely in place, undetectable until they activated during Richard's keynote. As the meeting concluded, Melissa addressed the Westmore team. It's been a pleasure working with you all. Archer will deliver our complete written report next week, but please reach out if you have any questions before then. We exchanged professional handshakes and parted ways. Our official business concluded. My access credentials would remain active until the end of the day, sufficient time for my final preparations. While the rest of the Archer team packed up our equipment, I made one last visit to the executive floor, ostensibly to verify a security configuration. My real purpose was to confirm the presentation system settings and ensure my modifications remained intact. The executive floor buzzed with pre-gala excitement. Staff hurried between offices, finalizing details and coordinating schedules. I moved through the space with professional purpose, my consultant badge ensuring no one questioned my presence. In the presentation control room, I verified that Richard's keynote was still scheduled as the centerpiece of the awards ceremony, immediately, following his acceptance of the Executive of the Year award. The file replacement protocol I'd established remained dormant but ready, set to trigger when his presentation began. As I was completing my check, Vanessa entered the control room, startling us both. "Oh, I didn't realize anyone was in here," she said, recovering quickly. "Are you finishing up the security assessment?" "Just verifying some final configurations," I replied calmly, closing my diagnostic screens. "Everything looks ready for the big event." She nodded, her expression reflecting the strain of event planning. "Mr. Westfield wants to do one final rehearsal of his keynote tomorrow morning. The presentation system will be available?" "Absolutely," I confirmed. "The system is fully operational. His files are loaded and ready. The files she knew about, at least." "Perfect," she said, then hesitated slightly. "You've been very thorough with this security audit. I appreciate your attention to detail." The irony of her gratitude was almost too much to bear, but I maintained my professional demeanor. Just doing my job. Everyone deserves a secure system they can rely on. As I left the executive floor for the last time, I passed Richard's office. Through the glass wall, I could see him rehearsing his speech, gesturing with practiced authority to an empty room. The man who had built his career and our marriage on deception was practicing for what he believed would be his crowning achievement. By this time tomorrow, that same room would be filled with security personnel and legal representatives as the company dealt with the fallout of his exposed corruption. I completed my final day at Westmore, turned in my temporary access badge and said goodbye to the Archer team, who believed I was headed back to our main office to help finalize the written report. "You did excellent work," Melissa told me as we parted. "Whatever happens next, be careful." Her knowing look suggested she had pieced together at least part of my intentions, but her words offered neither approval nor condemnation, just professional concern for a colleague. Back in my apartment that evening, I made my final preparations. I selected an emerald silk gown from my pre-divorce wardrobe, one Richard had always particularly admired. I arranged for a car service to take me to the gala. I prepared a secure thumb drive containing backup copies of all the evidence, in case my primary delivery method encountered unexpected obstacles. Most importantly, I reviewed every slide of the presentation that would replace Richard's keynote, ensuring each claim was factually accurate and supported by documented evidence. This wasn't about emotional vengeance. It was about exposing corporate malfeasance that had been hidden beneath a veneer of professional success. The Excellence Awards Gala invitation had arrived at our house weeks earlier, when Richard still believed he was managing a controlled exit from our marriage. I hadn't been expected to attend. Richard had made it clear this was a professional milestone he would be celebrating with the team. The team, in this context, clearly included Vanessa, but not his soon-to-be ex-wife. I carefully applied my makeup, styled my hair, and secured the invitation in my clutch beside the backup thumb drive. The woman who stared back from the mirror barely resembled the devastated wife who had discovered her husband's betrayal weeks earlier. She was composed, focused, and utterly determined. My phone chimed with a final text from Richard. Paperwork. Received back yet? Need this concluded ASAP. I didn't respond. In less than 24 hours, Richard would have answers to questions he hadn't even thought to ask. As I prepared for bed, knowing I needed to be rested for the coming confrontation, I found myself reflecting not on Richard's betrayal, but on my own transformation. The woman who had built her identity around supporting her husband's career had discovered a strength and capability she had allowed to lie dormant for too long. Tomorrow, at the Excellence Awards Gala, both Richard and I would reveal our true selves to the world. He would be exposed as a man who had built his success on deception and manipulation. And I would emerge as a woman who refused to be discarded without consequence. The stage was set. All the pieces were in place. In less than 24 hours, 5 years of betrayal would end with 5 minutes of irrefutable truth before the witnesses who mattered most to Richard. I slept soundly for the first time in weeks. The day of the Excellence Awards Gala arrived with picture-perfect weather, clear skies and a gentle breeze, as if the universe itself approved of my plans. I spent the morning methodically preparing, both mentally and practically. First, I verified that my digital preparations remained intact. A discreet remote check confirmed that the presentation system at Westmore was operating normally, with all scheduled content, including my modified version of Richard's keynote, in place and ready to activate. Next, I finalized my physical appearance for maximum impact. The Eleanor that Richard and Vanessa would see tonight needed to be simultaneously recognizable and transformed, familiar enough to be immediately identified, but changed enough to signal that I was no longer the compliant wife they had dismissed. I styled my hair differently than I had during my marriage, sleeker, more assertive. My makeup was impeccable but slightly bolder than the subtle palette Richard had always preferred. The emerald silk gown I'd selected was one he'd seen before, but I'd had it subtly altered to fit my now slimmer frame, the weeks of stress and focused work having reshaped my body along with my outlook. The final touch was jewelry, not the pieces Richard had given me over the years, but my grandmother's vintage diamond earrings and pendant. Family heirlooms that predated my marriage and symbolized a lineage of strong women who had endured their own challenges. As evening approached, I received a text from Melissa. Whatever happens tonight, remember you have options and allies afterward, her. Message was carefully worded to avoid explicit acknowledgement of my plans while offering support. I appreciated the gesture but knew this was a confrontation I needed to face alone. The car service arrived precisely at 7:15 p.m. As we drove toward the Astor Hotel, I felt an unexpected calm settle over me. There was no anxiety, no second-guessing, just a clear-eyed determination to see this through to its conclusion. We pulled up to the hotel's grand entrance at 7:40 p.m. According to the program, cocktails and mingling would be underway, with dinner scheduled for 8:30 p.m. and the awards ceremony to follow at 9:45 p.m. Richard's keynote, the centerpiece of the evening, would begin at approximately 10:15 p.m. The timing was perfect. I would arrive during the most socially active portion of the evening, when Richard would be circulating among executives and board members, basking in pre-award congratulations. His spotting me in that environment would create maximum disorientation, without allowing him sufficient time to intervene in my plans. The grand ballroom of the Astor Hotel glittered with crystal chandeliers and the shimmer of evening gowns. Westmore Technology's annual Excellence Awards Gala was the crown jewel of the corporate social calendar, and tonight, every executive, board member, and rising star was in attendance. I adjusted my emerald silk gown, feeling the weight of the thumb drive tucked discreetly in my clutch. After 15 years of marriage to Westmore's chief marketing officer, I knew exactly how these events unfolded. The practice speeches, the hollow congratulations, the strategic networking. But tonight would be different. As I approached the puy entrance, the security guard consulted his tablet. "Name, please?" "Eleanor Westfield," I replied, savoring the way his eyes widened slightly. "Mrs. Westfield, we weren't expecting— welcome. Mr. Westfield is already inside." I smiled. "I'm sure he is." The ballroom doors opened, revealing a sea of familiar faces. And there, at the center of an admiring circle, stood Richard, my husband, his arm casually draped around his executive assistant, Vanessa Moore. I checked my watch. In exactly 30 minutes, Richard would take the stage to accept his Executive of the Year award and deliver the keynote speech he'd been perfecting for weeks. The speech was stored on his company laptop. The speech I'd replaced this morning with something quite different. Richard's eyes met mine across the room, and I watched as shock, confusion, and then panic flashed across his face. He hadn't expected me here, not after serving me with divorce papers just 3 days ago. Certainly not after changing the locks on our home while I was visiting my mother. What he didn't know was that I'd spent the last month preparing for this moment, gathering evidence, building alliances, securing my future. The MC's voice echoed through the ballroom. "Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. Our program will begin in 15 minutes. Richard excused himself from his group and rushed toward me, his practiced smile strained at the edges. "Eleanor," he hissed under his breath, "what are you doing here?" I met his gaze steadily. "Supporting my husband on his big night. Isn't that what a devoted wife does?" His eyes narrowed, professional charm warring with genuine alarm. "This isn't appropriate. We're in the middle of divorce proceedings. You shouldn't be here." "I have an invitation," I replied calmly, opening my clutch to display the embossed card. "Mrs. Richard Westfield. That's still my name, at least for now." His jaw tightened as he glanced around to see if anyone was watching our exchange. "This is my professional milestone. You're making a scene." "I'm merely attending an event to which I was invited," I countered. "If anyone's creating awkwardness, it's the man who brought both his wife and his mistress to the same function." Color flooded his face. "You need to leave. Now." I smiled, the expression not reaching my eyes. "I'll be happy to leave after your keynote speech, Richard. I wouldn't miss it for the world." Before he could respond, Samuel Donovan, Westmore's CEO, approached with an outstretched hand. "Eleanor, what a wonderful surprise. We've missed you. At company events lately." Richard's expression froze in a rictus of professional pleasantry as I warmly greeted his boss. "Samuel, lovely to see you. I wouldn't miss Richard's big night for anything." Samuel beamed, oblivious to the tension. "That's what I like to see. Supportive spouses. My Judith has been my rock through every career advancement." He clapped Richard on the shoulder. "You're a lucky man, Westfield." "Incredibly fortunate," Richard managed, his voice tight. As Samuel moved on to greet other guests, Richard gripped my elbow, steering me toward a quieter corner of the ballroom. "Whatever you're planning, stop it now," he warned, his voice low and urgent. "This is my career we're talking about." "Yes, your career," I agreed. "Built on deception, both personal and professional. Did you really think there would be no consequences? Alarm flickered in his eyes. What are you talking about? Let's just say I've been productive while you've been busy with Vanessa and the new condo, I replied. Very productive. Before he could interrogate me further, the announcement came for guests to take their seats for dinner. Richard glanced toward the head table where Vanessa was already seated, clearly visible as she'd saved a place beside her. This conversation isn't over, he warned, then strode away, already recalibrating his evening plans to manage the unexpected complication of my presence. I made my way to a table near the back, where I'd been hastily accommodated according to the seating chart. My table companions were mid-level managers and their spouses, none of whom I knew well. They seemed mildly surprised to see me but were polite in their greetings. Throughout dinner, I felt Richard's gaze repeatedly landing on me from the head table. I ate calmly, engaged in pleasant conversation with my table mates, and gave no outward sign of the anticipation building within me. Vanessa, I noticed, was studiously avoiding looking in my direction while maintaining animated conversation with the board members seated nearby. Her hand occasionally touched Richard's arm in a gesture of intimate support that would have been devastating to me just weeks ago. Now it merely confirmed the righteousness of what I was about to do. As dessert was served, I observed Richard excuse himself from the head table and make his way to the audio-visual control booth at the back of the ballroom. No doubt he was checking his presentation one final time before his moment in the spotlight. I smiled slightly, knowing that what he was viewing was exactly what he expected to see. The substitution would not occur until the actual presentation began. He returned to his seat looking marginally more relaxed, crisis apparently averted in his mind. At 9:45 p.m. precisely, Samuel Donovan took the stage to begin the awards portion of the evening. Minor recognitions came first: sales achievements, innovation awards, team excellence acknowledgments. With each passing minute, we drew closer to the main event. Finally, at 10:10 p.m., Samuel's voice took on a more ceremonial tone. And now, ladies and gentlemen, we come to our highest honor of the evening. The Executive of the Year Award recognizes exceptional leadership, strategic vision, and outstanding contribution to Westmore's continued success. Richard straightened in his chair, adjusting his tie and bestowing a practiced, humble smile on those seated near him. This year's recipient has driven record-breaking marketing success, spearheaded our international expansion, and exemplified the values that make Westmore an industry leader. Please join me in congratulating our Chief Marketing Officer, Richard C. Westfield! Applause erupted as Richard rose and made his way to the stage, shaking hands and accepting congratulations as he went. He embraced Samuel, accepted the crystal trophy with appropriate gravitas, and stepped to the podium. Thank you, Samuel, and thank you to the Westmore Board for this tremendous honor, he began, his voice resonant with practiced sincerity. Success is never an individual achievement, and tonight I want to acknowledge the incredible team that has made this possible. He continued with expected acknowledgments: his department heads, key team members, supportive board directors. I noticed he made no mention of his wife, focusing instead on those who have been closest to my professional journey this past year, with a warm glance toward Vanessa. And now, he concluded the acceptance portion, I'd like to share some thoughts on the future of marketing in our industry and Westmore's unique position to lead that transformation. This was it, the moment of transition from acceptance speech to keynote presentation. The moment when control would shift from Richard to me. As Richard turned slightly to gesture toward the main screen, I saw his practiced smile falter momentarily as the display behind him flickered and changed. Instead of his title slide with Westmore's logo and Marketing in the Age of Authenticity, emblazoned across a dynamic background, a simple white screen appeared with the stark title, Financial Manipulation and Corporate Fraud, the Richard Westfield Method. Richard froze, staring at the screen in confusion. A murmur rippled through the audience. There seems to be a technical... Richard began, But the presentation advanced to the next slide automatically. This one showed a timeline of financial transactions, each bearing Richard's authorization code, each connected to offshore accounts that should never have been linked to Westmore's marketing operations. Richard spun to stare at the screen, genuine shock replacing his professional composure. He gestured urgently toward the AV booth, but the technicians were equally confused, frantically working their controls to no effect. The presentation continued inexorably, each slide revealing another layer of Richard's financial malfeasance. Transaction records, authorization codes, email communications discussing special arrangements with vendors. The evidence was methodical, comprehensive, and utterly damning. The ballroom had fallen completely silent, hundreds of eyes fixed on the unfolding exposition of corruption. Board members leaned forward, expressions shifting from confusion to concern to alarm. Samuel Donovan's face had gone rigid with shock. Richard lunged for the podium microphone. There's been some kind of security breach. This is not my presentation. Please. But the system advanced to the next slide, cutting off his desperate explanation. This slide showed the personal dimension, documents revealing his hidden marital assets, the misleading divorce paperwork he'd tried to pressure me into, signing, the timeline of his exit strategy that had been years in the making. And then, in a moment of perfect theatrical timing, the final slide appeared. A split-screen image of Richard's signature on his corporate ethics agreement alongside his signature on the fraudulent loan documents he'd created in my name. 5 minutes. That's all it had taken. 5 minutes to dismantle 15 years of marriage and a career built on systematic deception. From my seat near the back, I watched as Richard's world collapsed around him in real time. His face had drained of color. Vanessa was frozen in horror. Board members were already huddled in urgent conversation. Security personnel were moving toward the stage. I stood quietly and made my way toward the exit, my mission accomplished. As I reached the door, I cast one final glance back at the man I had once built my life around. Our eyes met across the crowded ballroom, and in that moment of recognition, I saw something I had waited weeks to witness. The realization that he had catastrophically underestimated me, the woman he had dismissed as obsolete, as a mere appendage to his life, had just systematically dismantled everything he valued. I stepped out into the cool night air, a sense of profound completion washing over me. The betrayal that had nearly destroyed me had instead catalyzed my rebirth. Behind me, I could hear the growing commotion as Westmore's leadership grappled with the public exposure of corruption in their ranks. That was no longer my concern. My 5 minutes of revenge had been delivered with precision, and now I was walking away toward a future entirely of my own making. The morning after the gala dawned with a strange serenity that belied the chaos I had unleashed. I awoke in my modest apartment, made coffee, and settled at my small dining table to watch the storm break across multiple fronts. It didn't take long. By 8 a.m., my phone was lighting up with notifications, news alerts, text messages, voicemails, emails. The corporate and personal earthquake I had triggered was sending aftershocks through multiple circles. The first call I answered was from my sister Kate. "My God, Ellie," she breathed when I picked up. "It's all over the financial news. Executive exposed during award ceremony. They're not naming you specifically yet, but it's only a matter of time," I acknowledged calmly. "I'm prepared." "For that? Are you?" Kate sounded concerned. "This is going to get ugly. Richard has powerful friends." "Had powerful friends," I corrected her. "They're distancing themselves as we speak. No one wants to be associated with financial fraud, especially when it's been so comprehensively documented." My assessment proved accurate when I checked my email. Among the various messages was one from Samuel Donovan himself. Timestamp 7:15. A.M. Mrs. Westfield. Given last night's extraordinary events, Westmore Technologies requests an immediate meeting with you to discuss the documentation presented during the Excellence Awards Gala. Our legal team will be present. as will members of the board's audit committee. While the manner of disclosure was highly irregular, the company takes allegations of financial impropriety extremely seriously. If the documentation can be verified, you have performed a significant service for our shareholders and clients. Please contact my office to arrange this meeting at your earliest convenience. Samuel Donovan, CEO, Westmore Technologies. The careful neutrality of his language was telling. Neither condemnation nor gratitude, just corporate pragmatism in the face of potential scandal. The acknowledgement that I had possibly performed a significant service suggested they had already begun. Verifying my evidence and finding it credible, I decided to let him wait for a response. The power dynamics had shifted, and I intended to maintain my newfound leverage. The second email of significance came from Melissa at Archer Solutions. Eleanor, I assume last night went according to your plan, given what's appearing in industry news. Archer has already received inquiries about our recent security audit at Westmore. I've confirmed we conducted a legitimate assessment and delivered appropriate recommendations. To be clear, you acted as an individual, not as an Archer representative, in whatever occurred after our professional engagement concluded. That said, if you need a professional reference for your actual audit work, which was excellent, I'm available. Take care of yourself. Things will be turbulent for a while. Melissa. Her careful distancing of Archer from my actions was expected and appropriate. I had been meticulous about separating my legitimate work from my personal mission, ensuring that neither Melissa nor her company would be implicated in my exposé. As I scrolled through other notifications, a breaking news alert appeared on my phone. Westmore Technologies announce leave of absence for Chief Marketing Officer following Gala incident. So it had begun. The corporate damage control was underway, starting with Richard's effective suspension. I expected a formal termination would follow once they had completed their internal investigation and verified the evidence I had presented. The most interesting message came shortly before noon, a text from Vanessa. I don't know how you did it, but you've destroyed him. The board has suspended him pending investigation. Security escorted him from the building this morning. He's been calling me nonstop, but I can't be associated with this. You've ruined everything. I considered responding, but decided against it. Vanessa's message revealed more about her character than perhaps she intended. Her concern was not that Richard had committed fraud or betrayed his marriage vows, but that their carefully constructed plans had collapsed. She wasn't leaving him because he was corrupt. She was leaving because he was caught. By early afternoon, I had prepared myself for the inevitable legal complexities to come. I contacted Claire Bennett, a formidable attorney I had researched weeks earlier in anticipation of this moment. Her specialty was complex divorce cases involving financial misconduct, and her reputation for tenacity was exactly what I needed. Her assistant arranged a meeting for 3 p.m. that same day. I arrived at her downtown office with a comprehensive file containing all my evidence, both of Richard's financial misconduct at Westmore and his systematic hiding of marital assets. Claire reviewed the materials with methodical precision, her expression revealing nothing until she had examined the entire package. "This is remarkably thorough," she said finally, looking up at me with new respect. "Most clients come to me with suspicions. You've brought me a complete case with documented evidence. I was a forensic analyst before I became Richard's wife," I explained. "Those skills never really disappeared, they just went dormant." She nodded appreciatively. "Well, they've served you exceptionally well. The corporate fraud aspects will certainly complicate the divorce proceedings, but largely in your favor. Once Westmore verifies your evidence, which I suspect they're doing right now, Richard's position becomes untenable on multiple fronts." "What should I expect next?" I asked. "A barrage," she replied candidly. "Richard's attorney will contact you with threats of defamation lawsuits, demands for retraction, possibly even criminal allegations of corporate espionage. All of this will be posturing designed to pressure you into a quiet settlement." "And your recommendation?" Stand firm, Claire said without hesitation. The evidence you've gathered changes everything. Instead of fighting for a fair division of known marital assets, we're now exposing hidden assets and linking them to possible criminal conduct. His priority will shift from winning to damage control very quickly. As Claire predicted, Richard's attorney reached out that evening with a blistering email threatening legal action for defamation, invasion of privacy, and corporate espionage. The message demanded immediate retraction of all allegations and warned of catastrophic legal consequences if I proceeded with this vindictive campaign of character assassination. Claire crafted a succinct response. Mr. Chambers, I represent Eleanor Westfield in all matters pertaining to her divorce from Richard Westfield and related concerns about financial misrepresentation. My client has documented evidence of substantial, hidden marital assets and concerning financial transactions involving Westmore Technologies. This evidence has been preserved through proper legal channels and shared with appropriate parties. We welcome the opportunity to present this evidence in court if necessary. Please direct all future communications to my office. Claire Bennett. As the following morning brought the development I had anticipated. Westmore Technologies issued a press release announcing an internal investigation into financial irregularities in their marketing department. Richard's temporary leave was upgraded to suspended pending investigation, and the company disclosed that they had engaged an independent forensic accounting firm to review the transactions I had exposed. By noon, financial news outlets were reporting that several board members had sold significant portions of their Westmore stock, anticipating further negative revelations. The company's share price had dropped 12% in morning trading. I received another text from Vanessa. They're questioning everyone who worked closely with Richard. I've been in meetings with legal all morning. What exactly did you give them? Again, I chose not to respond. Her growing panic was evident, suggesting she may have been more involved in Richard's schemes than I had initially suspected. At 2 p.m., I finally responded to Samuel Donovan's request for a meeting, agreeing to speak with Westmore's representatives the following day. Claire would accompany me to ensure the conversation remained focused on the corporate issues rather than the personal betrayal that had initiated my investigation. That evening, as I was preparing dinner in my small kitchen, my phone rang with a number I instantly recognized despite having deleted it from my contacts. Richard. After 3 weeks of communicating only through terse texts and attorneys, he was calling directly. I let it ring through to voicemail, curious what desperation might lead him to say. The message he left was revealing. Eleanor, this has gone far enough. You've made your point. Whatever you think I did to you, this response is disproportionate and destructive. We can still contain this if you cooperate with me now. The board is overreacting to uncontextualized information. I can explain everything if you just call off your crusade. Think about it. Do you really want to be known forever as the vindictive ex-wife who couldn't handle rejection? Call me back. We can find a solution that works for both of us. His message contained not a single acknowledgement of wrongdoing, not one word of apology for either the personal betrayal or the financial deception. Even now, facing professional ruin and possible legal consequences, Richard was attempting to manipulate me, to make me question my own actions rather than his. I saved the voicemail as evidence of his continued attempts at manipulation and forwarded it to Claire. Later that night, I received an unexpected email from Ben Winters, the nervous financial systems liaison from Westmore Ms. Vance, or I guess Mrs. Westfield. I didn't connect the dots until everything happened at the gala. I want you to know that some of us suspected something wasn't right with those marketing vendor arrangements, but nobody wanted to challenge Mr. Westfield directly. You did what many of us didn't have the courage to do. The independent auditors are finding even more irregularities than what you presented. I've been helping them navigate our systems. It's worse than anyone realized. Thank you for bringing this to light. Ben Winters. His message was the first unambiguous affirmation I had received, acknowledging not just the accuracy of my evidence, but the positive impact of my actions. It helped solidify my resolve for the difficult conversations to come. The following day, Claire and I met with Westmore's representatives in a conference room at her law firm, neutral territory that subtly established we were negotiating as equals, not as a company confronting a transgressor. Samuel Donovan was present, along with Westmore's chief legal officer, Patricia Winters, and 2 members of the board's audit committee. They brought with them an external forensic accountant whose grave expression suggested he had already verified key portions of my evidence. "Mrs. Westfield," Samuel began, his tone carefully balanced between corporate formality and reluctant respect. "I want to be clear that while we take issue with the method of disclosure, the substance of what you revealed appears to be accurate and deeply concerning to Westmore." Claire nodded. "My client chose a direct approach after discovering the extent of the financial irregularities. Given Mr. Westfield's position and influence within the company, conventional whistleblower channels presented significant risks of suppression." Patricia Winters, the CLO, leaned forward. "We need to understand exactly how you obtained this information. Mrs. Westfield, some of the documents presented would not normally be accessible to someone in your position." "My position," I replied calmly, "was that of a digital forensics specialist conducting a legitimate security audit of Westmore's systems through Archer Solutions. Every document I accessed was available to me through properly granted credentials during that professional engagement." This wasn't entirely accurate. I had used those legitimate credentials in ways that exceeded my assigned scope, but it was defensible enough to make them hesitate. The external accountant cleared his throat. "The transactions you identified are just the surface. We've already uncovered a more extensive pattern going back nearly 6 years. The vendor kickback scheme was sophisticated and would have been difficult to detect without knowing precisely where to look." Samuel looked troubled. "Which raises the question of how you knew where to look, Mrs. Westfield." Claire intervened, smoothly. "My client's background in forensic analysis, combined with her unique insights into Mr. Westfield's patterns of behavior, led her investigation. More importantly, the question isn't how she found it, but whether what she found is accurate." "Would you agree that it is?" The accountant nodded reluctantly. "The core financial improprieties appear to be substantiated by our preliminary review." The meeting continued for nearly 3 hours, with Westmore's representatives attempting to understand the full scope of Richard's misconduct while simultaneously assessing their legal exposure. I provided detailed explanations of the evidence I had gathered, carefully omitting any mention of methods that might cause complications for Archer Solutions. By the conclusion, it was clear that Westmore was primarily concerned with damage control, rather than pursuing any action against me. Samuel took me aside as the meeting broke up. "This is an unprecedented situation," he said quietly. "But I want you to know that the board recognizes you've ultimately done the company a service, despite the unconventional approach." "I wasn't thinking about doing Westmore a service," I replied honestly. "I was focused on exposing the truth about a man who had built a career on deception." Samuel studied me for a moment. "Well, you've certainly accomplished that. Richard's employment has been formally terminated as of this morning. The board has also voted to engage outside counsel to pursue recovery of misappropriated funds." Claire and I left the meeting. I felt a curious mixture of vindication and detachment. The corporate consequences were unfolding exactly as I had anticipated, but they seemed almost secondary now, necessary justice rather than the primary goal. That evening, news of Richard's termination broke publicly. Financial outlets reported that Westmore Technologies had dismissed its chief marketing officer following serious allegations of financial impropriety revealed during the company's annual awards event. My name wasn't mentioned, but industry insiders would easily connect the dots. I was preparing for bed when my phone chimed with an email notification from an address I didn't recognize. The subject line read simply, "I underestimated you." It was from Richard, writing from a personal account I hadn't seen before. "Eleanor, you've won. I've lost everything. My position, my reputation, possibly my freedom if the board pursues criminal charges. I never thought you capable of this level of calculated destruction. The quiet, supportive wife I married couldn't have orchestrated what you did at the gala. Perhaps that's the point you were making. I dismissed you as inconsequential to my plans, and you proved me catastrophically wrong. If that was your goal, congratulations. This doesn't have to continue toward mutual destruction. I'm prepared to offer a settlement that acknowledges all marital assets, including those you discovered. In return, I ask that you refrain from further public action that would completely eliminate any chance of me rebuilding some semblance of a career elsewhere. Consider this carefully. You've had your revenge. Is there value in pursuing total annihilation?" Richard, I forwarded the email to Claire without reply. His attempt to frame my actions as vindictive revenge rather than justified exposure of wrongdoing was predictable. More telling was his immediate pivot to negotiation, once he realized his position was untenable. A calculating pragmatism that had likely served him well in business, but revealed the fundamental transactional nature of his character. The days that followed brought a cascade of developments. Vanessa announced her resignation from Westmore, effective immediately. Several of Richard's closest colleagues in the marketing department were placed on administrative leave pending investigation. The financial press began publishing detailed analyses of the Westmore marketing scandal, with some reports suggesting the fraud might extend beyond what had been initially disclosed. Through it all, I maintained my silence publicly, engaging only through Claire with the necessary legal proceedings. The divorce case had transformed entirely, with Richard's attorney now seeking a swift settlement rather than the protracted battle they had initially threatened. Claire called on the 5th, day after the gala, with news. "They've presented a comprehensive settlement offer," she reported, sounding quietly satisfied. "Full disclosure of all assets, including the offshore accounts we didn't know about until now. Equal division of everything, plus compensation for legal fees and, interestingly, a formal acknowledgement of the professional damage you suffered by suspending your career during the marriage." "That's unexpected," I noted, surprised by the last provision. "They're worried about additional exposure," Claire explained. "Richard's legal problems are just beginning. The settlement includes a mutual non-disparagement clause, but specifically excludes any requirement that you withhold evidence from regulatory or law enforcement authorities. So I would be free to cooperate with any official investigation?" "Yes. He's not asking you to obstruct justice. Even he isn't that bold under the circumstances. He's merely hoping to avoid additional public revelations while he deals with the existing fallout." I considered the offer carefully. "What's your assessment?" "It's substantially better than what we could have achieved through normal litigation," Claire admitted. "The threat of continued public exposure has eliminated his willingness to fight. From a purely financial perspective, it's an excellent outcome." I thought about Richard's email, his framing of my actions as revenge and calculated destruction. There was a certain irony in his inability to recognize that I had simply applied the same methodical approach to uncovering truth that had once made me a successful forensic analyst. The skills he had dismissed as obsolete had proven to be his undoing. "I'll accept the settlement," I decided. Not because I'm finished with revenge, as he puts it, but because the truth is already doing its work without further action from me. 1 week after the gala, I received a call from Melissa at Archer Solutions. "I thought you should know," she said without preamble. "We've been engaged by Westmore's board to conduct a comprehensive security and financial systems audit. Apparently, they were impressed by how thoroughly our previous assessment identified vulnerabilities." I caught the amusement in her voice. "That's quite an opportunity for Archer." "Indeed. And they specifically requested that E. Vance be included on the project team if she's available for contract work. They were very impressed with her attention to detail. The offer was tempting, a chance to formally complete what I had begun, under cover of my alternate identity. But I had already decided on a different path forward. "Please thank them for the vote of confidence," I replied, "but E. Vance is moving on to new opportunities." Melissa's voice softened. "I thought you might say that. For what it's worth, Eleanor, what you did took extraordinary courage and skill. If you ever decide to return to forensic work professionally, Archer would be privileged to have you." That afternoon, I signed the final divorce settlement. Without the contentious litigation Richard had initially planned, the process was completed in record time, accelerated by his desperate desire to resolve at least one aspect of his collapsing life. As I left my attorney's office, a notification appeared on my phone, a news alert reporting that federal regulators had opened a formal investigation into financial irregularities at Westmore Technologies, specifically focusing on contract awards in the marketing department over the past 6 years. The wheels of justice were turning without any further intervention from me. The 5 minutes of truth I had delivered at the gala had set in motion consequences that would continue to unfold for months or even years to come. That evening, as I sat in my small apartment reviewing opportunities for the next chapter of my life, I found myself reflecting not on Richard's betrayal, but on my own transformation. The woman who had subordinated her identity to support her husband's ambitions had rediscovered her own strength, capability, and purpose. The betrayal that was meant to discard me as irrelevant had instead catalyzed a profound reclamation of self. In trying to render me powerless, Richard had inadvertently forced me to remember just how powerful I could be. My phone chimed with a text from Kate. "Saw the settlement news? Dinner to celebrate tomorrow? You're officially free." Free. The word resonated more deeply than I had expected. Free not just from a deceptive marriage, but from the constrained version of myself I had gradually become within it. "Absolutely," I replied. "I have some ideas about next steps I want to run by you." Those next steps were already taking shape. In my mind, not a return to corporate forensics, but something that would use those same skills to help others who had been victims of financial deception. The clarity and purpose I had discovered through my own ordeal could be channeled into something constructive and meaningful. Richard's 5-year affair had ended with my 5-minute revenge at his company gala. But the story that would define the rest of my life was just beginning. 1 year after the gala that had changed everything, I sat in my new office overlooking the city skyline, reviewing the final draft of my book, Hidden in Plain Sight, A Guide to Recognizing Financial Deception. The publisher had just sent the cover design featuring my name, Eleanor Vance, beneath the title. I had reclaimed not only my maiden name, but my entire professional identity. The intercom buzzed. "Ms. Vance, your 2 o'clock consultation is here," my assistant announced. "Send her in, please," I replied, closing the manuscript file and opening the case notes for my newest client. Jessica Miller entered with the hesitant posture I had come to recognize in those first steps of reclaiming their power. Like me a year earlier, she carried the stunned expression of someone whose reality had suddenly shifted beneath her feet. "Thank you for seeing me," she said, settling into the chair across from my desk. "My attorney said you specialize in situations like mine." I nodded, giving her the space and respect I had once desperately needed. Claire mentioned the basics. 15-year marriage, husband controls the finances, sudden request for divorce with an immediate settlement offer that doesn't add up. Jessica's eyes widened slightly. "Yes. He insists we only have the house equity and his 401k, but he's been in investment banking for 20 years. Something doesn't feel right." "Trust that instinct," I affirmed. "In the majority of cases I handle, when something doesn't feel right about financial disclosures, it's because they're incomplete at best, fraudulent at worst." As we discussed her situation, I found myself reflecting on how completely my life had transformed. The financial forensics group I had founded 6 months after my divorce had quickly established itself as the premier resource for individuals facing complex financial deception in divorce, partnership dissolutions, and estate disputes. What had begun as my personal journey toward justice had evolved into a thriving practice that helped others navigate similar terrain. After walking Jessica through our investigation process and arranging follow-up appointments, I escorted her to the reception area where my team of 5 financial analysts, all specialists in different aspects of asset investigation, were working diligently on active cases. "How did the Broderick meeting go?" asked Diane, my operations director and the first person I had hired when the demand for our services outgrew my solo practice. "Very promising," I replied. "They want to partner on a workshop series for divorce. Attorneys on recognizing digital evidence of hidden assets." My phone chimed with a news alert, something I had once configured to track developments in Richard's case, but now maintained for industry updates relevant to our work. This particular notification, however, was indeed about Richard. Former Westmore executive released from prison after serving 14 months of sentence. I glanced at it briefly, feeling a curious detachment. Richard's journey through the legal system, his indictment, plea agreement, sentencing, and now release, had become increasingly irrelevant to my life. The 5 minutes of exposure at the eye, Gala had set consequences in motion that had unfolded exactly as justice required, without any further intervention from me. Later that evening, as I prepared for dinner with Michael, the architectural engineer I had been dating for the past 4 months, I received an unexpected email. The sender was Vanessa Moore. "Eleanor, you don't owe me your time or attention, but I hope you'll read this. With Richard's release today, I felt compelled to reach out. I didn't fully understand what he had done to you until it all came crashing down. The financial deception, the calculated exit strategy, it was all so much worse than I knew. Or perhaps I chose not to know. I'm not seeking forgiveness, just offering acknowledgement that what you did at the gala wasn't revenge. It was justice, and perhaps thanking you. Your actions ultimately freed me from a relationship built on the same dishonesty that characterized his marriage to you. I'm in Phoenix now, starting over. Ironically, I've become vigilant about financial transparency in all my relationships. A lesson learned the hard way. I hope you found peace and purpose in the aftermath." Vanessa, I sat with the email for several minutes, appreciating its unexpected honesty. I had long ago released the anger I'd felt toward Vanessa, recognizing that while her choices were her responsibility, Richard had been the architect of the deception that had ensnared us both. I crafted a brief, genuine response. "Vanessa, thank you for your message. You're right that the gala wasn't about revenge. It was about truth finally having its moment after years of calculated deception. I have indeed found peace and purpose, building something meaningful from what was meant to break me. I hope your fresh start in Phoenix brings you the authenticity and clarity you're seeking." Eleanor, as I sent the message, I realized how completely I had transcended the identity of the betrayed wife. That chapter had closed, leaving me not diminished, but expanded by its challenges. The woman Richard had dismissed as obsolete had not only rebuilt her life, but was now helping others reclaim theirs. My sister Kate arrived to pick me up for dinner, greeting me with her characteristic exuberance. "Ready for your big night, Michael?" Sounded nervous when he called to confirm reservations. "I think someone might have a significant question to ask," she teased as we headed to the elevator. I smiled, appreciating her enthusiasm but feeling none of the desperate validation-seeking that had characterized my younger self. "If he does, I'll consider it thoughtfully, but my happiness doesn't depend on that outcome anymore." Kate squeezed my arm affectionately. "That's exactly why you deserve every good thing coming your way. You built this new life on your own terms." As we drove through the city toward the restaurant, I found myself reflecting on the extraordinary journey of the past year. Richard's betrayal had been meant to discard me as irrelevant, a convenient disposal of someone who no longer served his narrative. Instead, it had become the catalyst for my most authentic self to emerge. The 5-year affair that was meant to diminish me had ended with 5 minutes of truth that had ultimately liberated me, not just from a deceptive marriage, but from the constraints I had placed on my own potential while trying to fit into someone else's story. The woman who had once measured her worth through her husband's approval now measured it through the lives she helped transform, the business she had built, and the authentic connections she had formed, with clients, colleagues, friends, and perhaps with Michael, whose integrity and transparency had earned my carefully considered trust. As we pulled up to the restaurant, I spotted Michael waiting by the entrance, his face lighting up when he saw me. Whatever the evening might hold, proposal or simply shared companionship, I was meeting it as my complete self. Eleanor Vance, a woman who had transformed betrayal into purpose and reclaimed not just her financial security, but her entire sense of identity. The truest revenge I had discovered wasn't exposing Richard at the gala. It was the life I had created in the aftermath, a life so full and purposeful that he had become merely a footnote in my story rather than its defining chapter. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.